Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Farmer, and I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so just explaining a bit about why I think we need to find a different way to build homes in this country. And in doing that, how we need to navigate the issue of balancing innovation and risk. And this is obviously highly relevant to the fire safety sector. And I wanted to explore some thoughts in terms of where I'm coming from in relation to the role of modern methods of construction. And probably the initial part of this presentation is more about setting the scene. Back in 2016, I wrote a report for the UK government, commissioned jointly between the Housing Ministry and the Business Department, looking at the construction industry's labour model. And my conclusions of that report were pretty damning. And you can see there on the left, the title of my report was Modernise or Die. And that was pretty much the challenge I put down to the industry in terms of having to think differently about how it faces the future and to really face the risk of becoming an extinct industry in many respects in relation to the challenges that lay ahead. I identified 10 symptoms of failure, which you see there on the slide, and I'm not going to go through all of those now, but they're all features of our industry, and they reflect the way in which the industry has shaped itself to operate in what is a very difficult environment. It's in one of the most cyclical industries you have in the economy. It's a boom bust culture that we operate in construction, and all of those things you see there on the right hand side are consequences of that resiliency that's been built into our industry over many years. Unfortunately, though, my conclusions from the report back in 2016 were that the industry's resiliency is actually declining, and declining in a structural way. So not a short-term feature, but something which is about a long-term pattern of the inability actually to bounce back and recover, particularly after each downturn in an economic cycle. And that lack of resiliency is probably best demonstrated in this graphic here, where you see UK construction employment over a long run period of 40 odd years, and you see there that you effectively have the boom and bust cycles of economic pattern of recession and boom going all the way back to the early 1980s. And what's really interesting is that the move towards the peak period of construction employment in each cycle is showing a marked pattern of behaviour here. So what you have is effectively the increase in construction employment in each cycle has got less and less since the early 1980s recession. So in the peak period of the late 1980s, that increase in construction employment from under 2 million to 2.2 million was then diminished in the period from the late 1980s through to the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008. And then in turn, in the last cycle since the global financial crisis, construction never got back up to its peak employment position that it was at back in 2008. And that's a worrying sign, because what that's showing is that actually the industry is struggling to regain labour capacity when it goes through a growth period. And what we've now got is a period where that risk has been further amplified by Brexit. We have an industry that is highly dependent on migrant labour, including EU nationals, both in terms of professional and technical staff, but trade operatives, both skilled and unskilled. And even in the last few weeks, we've had assertions from government that there will be no special dispensation for the likes of bricklayers and the like, where we have skill shortages. So the government are clearly saying that the industry has to start sorting out its labour resourcing issues on a domestic basis, and actually in turn reduce the labour dependency it has by looking to innovate new techniques that actually involve less site labour for any given level of output. And on top of all of that, we've now got the COVID-19 situation, which has really thrust into the spotlight once more this site labour intensive model that we use in construction. So back in March this year, we pretty much had a shutdown across all UK construction sites. We then started to open up those sites again, but clearly not being able to socially distance and creating public health issues and negative press, actually, if you remember in the media. And then we got to a point where we worked out that there was a safe way of operating on construction sites, but it involved socially distancing, which in turn has led to a reduction in output. There's a whole series of operating procedures that have been worked out with government and the Construction Leadership Council. Effectively, that has meant that we cannot produce the same amount of output from construction sites as we could pre-COVID, because there's less people involved on the construction sites. And none of this would be relevant if it wasn't for the fact that we have such poor productivity in construction. So what we're seeing now is added pressures on the industry to deliver against a backdrop of poor productivity, labour constraints in terms of access to resources, and now the likes of COVID further adding to that problem. And these symptoms of failure that I started the presentation with are showing themselves now in a way perhaps that we haven't seen before, particularly in the residential sector where I work in housing and residential. And the fire sector, in my view, should be really concerned about what this means for traditional construction before we even get on to the issues of modern methods of construction. And the headlines have been extensive over the last 4 to 5 years in particular, where we've had headline after headline talking about poor quality build in new build housing, whether it's house builders, whether it's housing associations, the headlines prevail. And many of those issues relate to fire related risks. So this all is a manifestation of these symptoms of failure. We have an industry that has declining skills base. It's being asked to deliver more and more with either the same or less labour. There's issues around competency and skills, which I'll come back to shortly. And all of this is leading to more and more instances of failure. And on top of that, we have this sort of behavioural challenge in our industry. Construction is this notorious for its inability to commercially manage itself in many respects, and the whole market mechanism of supply and demand leads itself to some pretty poor behaviour around procurement. So clients asking for the cheapest price and wanting to exploit a situation when there's limited work to drive prices down. Even when times are good, the industry is very good at trying to pursue the race to the bottom, as it's called, and that ultimately drives quality. It drives outcomes. You get what you pay for is the maxim, and that's very much true in construction. So that was a bit of scene setting, and what I would say is that over the last 4 to 5 years, there's been probably an unprecedented period of UK government awareness building around the role of construction. My review back in 2016 perhaps set off a bit of a chain reaction in report writing, unfortunately, but all of these reports around housing policy, industrial strategy, the role of off-site manufacture, the role of government policy in driving MMC, the construction sector deal, which is part of the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, the recognition from government that we have to decarbonise our industry, and now the recovery from COVID. All of these issues have led to a need to question how we build and actually look fundamentally at how we build in a different way. And I'd also say that this sort of government interest in construction is perhaps different from what I've seen in my career previously. And over the last 30 years, I've seen lots of attempts by government to stimulate construction activity. But I think there's now sort of wider issues, societal change and big picture change, which are forcing politicians to actually force the industry to think differently. And that's really, in my mind, about quantity and quality. So there's been many cases in the past where we've driven quantity and we wanted to increase housing output, or we build more schools and hospitals, but quality has always been seen as a secondary element. But I think we're now in a different scenario where, for the reasons in the document set out on the screen there, whether it's the building safety debate, which is clearly very relevant for your conference, whether it's the more general consumer redress debate and the role of the incoming new homes ombudsman, whether it's the carbon debate and the incoming future home standard, or the wider debate that pervades our industry around competency and the lack of competency in many respects that is actually undermining our ability to drive forward. All of these issues are now government politically sensitive issues that are actually going to force quantity and quality to happen side by side. And going back to COVID and the reaction and the implications of COVID, the government has recognised as well in a post-COVID recovery that it needs this construction industry to be performing at the highest level. It needs to be a driver of economic growth and recovery, but it can also use economic stimulus measures that it might impose in a way to really drive the use of MMC and modern methods and innovation. And all of those headlines you see there, whether it's the housing sector or it's the wider public works around prisons or schools or hospitals that you see at the bottom there, are examples of headlines in the last few months that relate to how the government wants to push MMC MMC through policy as part of its construction recovery agenda. And clearly, the conference that I'm speaking at here in terms of Fire 2020 is about fire safety. This is at the heart of the debate, and why you want to understand about modern methods of construction and what does that mean around the risks of fire safety. And Grenfell has quite rightly generated a debate across all parts of the construction industry, and we need to generally respond to that. And I think one thing I would say, and there's been often quoted comparisons made to the fact that construction has proved to be capable of changing itself. And many will talk about the health and safety changes that have happened, the fact that we have less fatalities every year in construction operations. Many people say that's a good precedent for us being able to actually deal with the issues of quality and how we build safe buildings as opposed to just the processes. My view is slightly more pessimistic on that, because this is not just a health and safety issue. Much of what the health and safety changes have been driven by over the last 20 years has been actually pretty much common sense. But the point here is that to build safe, highly complex and technical buildings, you need more than common sense. You need technical competence, and the two are not the same. And unfortunately, my view is that you need to combine the technical standards, the competence, better assurance with a cultural change in how we go about designing, commissioning, designing and building built assets. And that's a lot different to just a common sense approach to embracing health and safety. And unfortunately, that's going to mean that the structural issues and skills that I've spoken about are going to be even more amplified, because we're going to be able to access less people who are actually appropriate and competent to do the jobs that we need in our industry. If we look back about how we've, over the last 10 to 15 years, perhaps, as to how we've tried to innovate, actually quite a lot of stuff has gone on in the design side of what we do as an industry. So the use of 3D models and AutoCAD and Revit and those kind of proprietary systems is actually very well accepted now. But as you move into the construction process through procurement, you go to the right hand side of that slide, you go through competitive tendering in a very normal way. So irrespective of detailed design through using digital platforms, we procure in a very, very backward way. It's back to lowest price. And then when we get to site, we are insistent on using these site labour intensive processes that involve lots of people doing things in an unstructured analog way. So the digital thread that starts on the left does not make it to the right hand side. So the risk of failure of doing actually what we said we were going to do in a digital design is very high. And lots of people will talk about the analogy, is it a faster horse, or is it going to be a Ford Model T? The problem with our industry is that we actually have a horse towing a Ford Model T or a car at the moment, and that's the sort of weird contradiction we have around the fact that we're only as strong as the weakest link. And our weakest link is the fact that when we get to site and our processes are just analog traditional processes, they cannot be verified and assured. And that's why, in my view, we have to move towards more automated working. We have to look at digital design linked to digital manufacturing, linked to a whole suite of digital tools on site that better assure the outcomes that we're driving. And inherent in that is fire safety. And the whole debate about modernisation and MMC needs to start with defining what we mean by MMC. And last year, I worked with the Ministry of Housing to come up with this definition, which I would commend you all to have a look at, which defines 7 categories of MMC in the housing sector, ranging from modular, volumetric, which is category 1, through into panelised systems, into sub-assemblies, into innovative materials, through to digital construction techniques on site. So when we talk about MMC, and when government talks about MMC in policy terms, it's not just modular housing or buildings that we're talking about. We're talking about a whole suite of different techniques, and you can see some of them there in those pictures, of ranging from modules through to robotics on site, laser scanning, exoskeletons helping people lift stuff. There's a whole series of different approaches that MMC embraces that all have different implications around fire safety and risk, and MMC should not be badged just as modular, because it's a lot more than that. This extract here from a report that McKinsey published a few months ago is very telling, because what it's showing is that the largest area of potential disruption that McKinsey are anticipating in the future is that purple bar that you see towards the right there, which says 20 to 30%, which is off-site construction. So there is a growing weight of evidence that the construction process is going to get disrupted, and more of that is going to be about transferring processes from on-site to off-site. So there's going to be a change of who the players are, who does what where, who is it that's actually in that process from start to finish, and what does that mean around the value chain. And I think it's fair to say, looking at some of the skepticism exists around MMC, and including from the fire sector, that headlines like you see here, they can't be ignored and they absolutely need to be faced into. But what we need to now understand is there a risk in innovation, or actually are some of these headlines overblown? We need to get to the facts, and we need to get to the building science behind some of the things that have happened where there is a coalescence of fire and MMC in some form being used. And I'm the first one to want to know if we're actually creating issues, and if so, how do we avoid that in the future? And that building an evidence base of using R&D and performance measurement to actually test how MMC is done is a really important element of this. And here's a couple of examples where demonstration projects have been commissioned. One here in Gateshead. The images on the right hand side are from the Gateshead Innovation Village, where lots of different forms of MMC were built in the real world and actually create an occupied development now. And then on the left, the Riverside scheme in Sunderland, which Sunderland City Council are trying to drive as an expo, which is going to be about, again, driving in the real world demonstration of how MMC works. And that should inherently include performance in safety. And Homes England are playing their part as well. They've embarked on a big R&D program across some of their sites, capturing all those criteria you see on the right hand side there, which at least two are highly relevant to the discussion today around safety and quality and delivery performance. If we can get this evidence base, we can build confidence in innovation, and we can start to overcome any concerns that we're baking in further failures in the future. And I think from a position of standards and technical accreditation of MMC, a lot of work's been done over the last period of time to drive that forward. And I've been involved in trying to get the warranty providers, including NHBC and BLP and LABC and Premier Guarantee, to actually start to collaborate on standards. And that has led to a MOU being agreed between them in terms of all aligning on a common standard as to how they assess MMC. I suppose my evolution on that is something I would point you towards that's happened in New Zealand, where New Zealand has gone further and actually is moving the world of MMC into its building regulations. So it has a bill that it's going through consultation with at the moment, which is called the Building Products and Methods Modular Components Amendment Bill, which is actually allowing MMC that's properly accredited to be fast-tracked because it's been factory signed off. The ability to actually know it's been done properly, and it's got a quality planned approach. So this idea of quality planning we see in manufacturing sectors like automotive and aerospace should be the way that we drive the industry forward. It needs insurers to actually demand this. These underwriters to say we're not going to actually sign off unless you're deploying these kind of approaches. And the whole idea of MMC standards as well needs further collaboration, and I'm right in the heart of trying to help facilitate some of that collaboration. So the bodies you see there, I'm trying to get everyone together on the same pitch, as it were, to work out how we allay any concerns around fire safety in this world of innovation and off-site construction. And we're early doors, but I'm hopeful we can make some good progress. And one of the other issues here is for government to be very clear on this contradiction that's starting to show itself between combustibility and banning combustible materials, particularly in cladding and facade systems, and the need to decarbonise. There's a lot of confused people out there trying to work out, well, how can you have timber or steel and concrete in a world where actually we're trying to decarbonise, and you've got high embodied carbon in more traditional materials, but timber is going to be banned in some scenarios. So government needs to play a role in changing that. We also need to change the skills and training landscape. It's taking too long to get new accredited courses through, whether it's apprenticeship standards like you see here, from level 2 to level 6. We need new skills and competencies to be able to deliver MMC, and we need these courses run out at scale. And I think just to close, One thing we should all be glad of is this sort of media focus that has fallen on construction, particularly home building. Some would say it's a negative thing, but I actually think it's a behavioural change agent. The fact that social media and mainstream media is able to now cast its eye over what's happening in the sector has to drive change, because the behavioural change will come from brand risk and reputational risk. And I think ultimately what we should expect is a world where construction becomes a TripAdvisor type rating system. And in Australia, I would point you towards an initiative that's just playing out as we speak, where a rating system is being put in place in New South Wales. That means that if you're not up to scratch, you won't get a certificate of occupation of your development. And that's a major barrier that actually, again, is driving behavioural change. And, you know, we only have to look at what's coming out of the Grenfell inquiry to know how significant some of the issues are that I've described over the last 20 minutes. This is a blame game. It's about cutting corners. It's about lack of competency, and it's about cutting costs that shouldn't be cut. And ultimately, we need to move on from that. And in conclusion, hopefully what I've tried to demonstrate in a rapid fire way over the last 20 minutes is that we need change. We need business model change. We need behavioural change. We need process change. My view is that modern methods of construction are a vital part of that, but it needs to be done right. And for me, I'd leave you with this slide, which is my summary of the 10 characteristics of what I think a safe, custom-focused future home building sector has to include. All of those 10 elements for me are critical if we're going to make a success of innovation in our industry and move on from the problems that we've had in the past. So I'd like to thank you for listening. Hopefully that has made some sense in terms of my position on MMC. I'm a champion of MMC, but I also want to have responsible innovation. Thank you for listening.